This week on the GCN Racing News Show, two of the best news stories I've seen in a long time. Stig Broeckx is back on a bike and a child prodigy steals the show at the Tour of Britain. Well, almost. I mean, Wout van Aert did a pretty good job of stealing the show and everything else in that race. Whilst we had one of the most thrilling one-day races of the season at the Men's European Championships, I'll be wrapping up all those races from those championships in Trento, plus the GP Fourmies, and Mathieu van der Poel is back. And he's bad, as in a good bad, not a bad bad. And actually, we'll start briefly with exactly that. The Antwerp Ports Epic is not a huge race, but it seems to have all the ingredients to become one. Gravel, cobblestones, and Mathieu van der Poel. The 183-kilometre race in Belgium marked a return to competition for the Dutchman, who's been sidelined with a back injury since that crash at the Olympic mountain bike race a few weeks ago. Things had already splintered to pieces with 30 k's to go, and it looked like it had been a tough day out not only for the riders, but also for one of the sports directors, unless they deliberately parked their car neatly in the ditch here. By that point in the race, only a dozen or so riders were left in contention at the head of the race, and it wasn't long before 12 became 2. Van der Poel unleashing one of his trademark lethal accelerations, with only Taco van der Hoorn of Intermarché Wanty-Gobert able to follow him. And it was the two of them who would ride in towards the finish line, and like the Men's European Championships, which I'll come on to shortly, there was only ever going to be one result at the line. Van der Hoorn went first, but as soon as Van der Poel kicked, there was immediately a gap, and actually an official 1 second gap between them at the line. So, he's back. But is he at his best, and will he be doing the Worlds and Paris-Roubaix? Well, that was the question that was posed to him after the race, and when asked, he remained fairly tight-lipped, saying it would all depend on how his back is in the coming days. It is a mouth-watering prospect though, isn't it? Van der Poel up against an in-form Wout van Aert and all the other favourites at the Flanders World Championships and the cobbles of Paris-Roubaix 1 week later. Here's hoping his back holds up. So let's get on to those European Championships, and I'm going to start with that men's race. Now, I will admit, I was slightly apprehensive about commentating on the entire 180 kilometres. However much you love it, that is a long time to be talking over a bike race, knowing that there will be long periods with not a lot happening. But I needn't have worried, as there seemed to be something happening for every single one of those 180 kilometres. A group of 4 went away early, but with the biggest hills coming at the start of the race, in the Dolomites around Trento in Italy, Spain and France clearly wanted to make it a very hard race. At one point, actually, 6 of the 8-man Spanish team were up the road, including David de la Cruz and Mikel Landa. So aggressive had the race been that by the time they reached the circuits, with still almost 100 kilometres to go, there were only about 50 riders left in contention, and that number reduced steadily as the laps ticked by. An attack by Stig Broeckx forced a group of 5 clear in the closing stages, which in turn forced France to chase behind. They'd missed the move, and with a lack of race radios, it wasn't until they went through the feed zone and saw a sign saying "France, we work," that they set to work. The ferocious pace that they did set up the following climb allowed Benoit Cosnefroid to hop across to the front with a few others, including Remco Evenepoel, and we would ultimately have a group of 9 riders out front fighting it out for the win. We knew it wouldn't stay 9 riders to the finish though, we just didn't know when the first attack would come. But the answer was on the penultimate ascent. Pavel Sivakov, riding for Russia, knew that he lacked a fast sprint, so he made the first move, but it really only served as a nice launch pad for Evenepoel. He shot off like a ball out of a cannon at that point in the race. The pain etched across the face of Cosnefroid, who just about held his wheel over the top, I think said it all. Remco is back, and when he's that confident, it's a painful ride for those behind him. The problem he faced was that the other man to stick with him was Sonny Colbrelli of Italy. That put Evenepoel in a very difficult situation. Even with Cosnefroid distance early on the final climb, if he doesn't get rid of Colbrelli, he comes second. So he did the only thing he could do. He rode an incredibly high tempo up that final climb, accelerating on a couple of occasions in the second half of it to try and go solo. And it almost worked. Colbrelli was rocking and rolling all over his bike, more than normal, but he managed to hang on. And it's at this point where I thought that Evenepoel's lack of experience really showed. So in my opinion, once the two of them went over the top of that climb together, the roles should have reversed. Up it, the responsibility was with Evenepoel to do the riding. There was no advantage to Colbrelli taking turns, knowing that the more energy expended and the more Evenepoel saved, the more likely it was that he'd be dropped on that climb. However, once they hit the top, that responsibility should have gone entirely onto the shoulders of Colbrelli. From there was no benefit to Evenepoel expending any extra energy, knowing that Colbrelli would be faster in the sprint. Just sit on, let Colbrelli do all the work, and at least give yourself a slightly better chance at the finish. That's not what happened though. Evenepoel spent more time riding on the front than Colbrelli in that last 10Ks, and up against the experience and speed of the Italian in the sprint, there was only ever going to be one winner. Colbrelli taking the gold medal on home soil in front of an ecstatic crowd. Slightly less ecstatic though was a frustrated Evenepoel, who sat on the floor before making an FU gesture. Now, don't get me wrong here, I'm a big fan of Evenepoel. When he's in a race, you know it's going to be exciting to watch. He's a super talent, the likes of which only comes along once in a while, but he's still got a fair bit to learn, I think, which is completely understandable because he only started racing a bike seriously 3 years ago, and he hasn't had to learn tactics because he just used his power to ride away from everyone else in the junior ranks, and he's managed to do that on a lot of occasions in the pro ranks too. But when that doesn't work, he seems a bit lost as to what to do. The lack of race radios yesterday didn't help, and it would have been the same case at the Belgian Nationals earlier this year, where he rode with Wout van Aert and Ed Teuns to the line, and then seemed surprised that he was third from 3 in the sprint. Now you might be thinking I'm being a little bit too harsh. After all, had he sat on Colbrelli the whole way in, it's still likely he would have been beaten to the line. But you've got to try. Yes, Colbrelli still would have been fastest if a group had caught them from behind, and Evenepoel might not have even medalled. However, it is easier to attack a group and go solo than it is to attack just one rider who only has one person to react to. He's such a talent, and I just feel like he has more to be gained by being coached on tactics rather than being coached physiologically by his team, De Koning Quickstep. Either way, the day belonged to Colbrelli, and that in fact was the 4th win in a row for the Italians at the men's race in an event that only started in 2016. Not a bad record. They'll just be hoping they can repeat that at the upcoming World Championships, which they haven't won since 2008. In Colbrelli though, they will certainly go into it with one of the big favourites to win, and it feels like he's more than justified sole leadership status within the Squadra Azzurra after recent months. In the women's race, all eyes were on the Dutch team, who were notable by their absence in the men's. This race took place entirely on those local Trento circuits, and after a number of early attacks, mainly from the French team, a quartet of riders would eventually sail up the road. 4 soon became 3, with Bionic of France dropped on the climb, and soon after we had the bizarre pictures of the Dutch team setting the pace on the front of the peloton, despite Ellen van Dijk in the break. Marianne Vos by that point had been unexpectedly dropped. And Van Dijk was clearly on a very good day. Casper of Germany was the next to be dropped, and just under 1 lap later, Paladin of Italy popped 2, leaving Van Dijk solo out front. It didn't look like it would be the case for long though, because an almighty attack from Germany's Liane Lippert brought the gap down to under 10 seconds with still 20 kilometres to go. However, with Lippert brought back and the group all looking at each other, Van Dijk, with the help of her teammates blocking the chase behind, started to extend her advantage again. In fact, it was almost a minute as she started the final climb, and that had only been halved by the time she got to the top, at which point there was no catching the Dutch woman. Van Dijk did what she does best, time trialling her way to the finish line to take her first win in a road race since Dwars-door-Vlaanderen over 2 years ago. And it was the end of a brilliant week for Van Dijk, who'd also picked up a silver medal at the individual time trial earlier in that week. Marlon Russe, who's been flying for the last couple of months, was dominant there and took the gold medal for Switzerland. And they also took the gold medal in the men's. Filippo Ganna, Stefan Bissegger and Remco Evenepoel had started as the pre-race favourites, but Stefan Kung, reigning champion, had other ideas. Averaging almost 55 kilometres per hour over the 22k course, he would finish 8 seconds in front of Ganna, 15 in front of Evenepoel, with Bissegger just outside the medals in 4th. And I was really pleased to see Kung get that win. He so often seems to have been the nearly man in the really big time trials this year. He deserved that, and he can be even more content when he looks at the names behind him on the results sheet. Just before we move on, a quick nod to the men's under-23 road race there in Italy. The son of Sven Nys shall, from this point onwards, not be referred to as the son of Sven Nys. He's making a huge name for himself in his own right. Thibaut Nys is already a world champion in cyclocross, but at just 18 years of age, he became the under-23 champion of Europe on Saturday, outsprinting Filippo Baroncini of Italy and young Spanish sensation Juan Ayuso, who was 3rd. In the women's event, Silvia Zanardi took home another win for the home country. Moving on to the Tour of Britain now, which culminated with an incredibly exciting finale in Aberdeen yesterday. But before I get onto that racing, I have to start with the clip that went viral on Saturday evening. A young lad named Xander Graham was on the path on the side of the road and launched a thermonuclear attack as the day's breakaway approached him. They did eventually manage to catch him, and as they did, Pascal Encorn of Jumbo-Visma offered him his bottle. Such a simple yet incredibly generous and important gesture that summed up everything that is good in cycling, in my mind. That will have made Xander's day, probably his year, and I dare say we may well see him doing something similar in the pro peloton in years to come. Absolutely brilliant. And just when you thought it couldn't get any better for him, the following day he was invited to the race as a guest of the organisation and then invited onto the Jumbo-Visma team bus where he received some kit and met the team, and then he was taken onto the podium with them. How cool is that? And hats off to Jumbo-Visma, brilliant stuff. And they were just as brilliant in the race itself. I think it's safe to say that Wout van Aert is in reasonably good form. After winning the Stage 1 uphill finish, he went on to win Stage 4 on the awfully steep slopes of Great Orme. He managed to get around Julian Alaphilippe there, despite a rather dramatic swerve by the world champion. And that gave him the overall race lead, but it was a ding-dong battle between him and Ethan Hayter of the Ineos Grenadiers. The Brit rider won Stage 5, and although Van Aert won again on Stage 6, finishing second was enough for Hayter to remain in the lead with just 2 stages to go. Yves Lampaert gave the Koenig Quick-Step something to celebrate by winning Stage 7 from the early breakaway, and with a probable bunch sprint on the final day, Van Aert would need to somehow find 4 seconds on Hayter there. And he found even more than that. It looked like the Belgian champion had got boxed in a sprint from 10 years ago with Mark Cavendish and Andre Greipel fighting it out to the line, but he found the room and he found the power coming around both of them before the finish. And with Hayter unable to follow and finishing outside the bonus seconds on the day, it meant heartbreak for him at the very last. Van Aert took the stage, his 4th of the 8-day race and the general classification. And if you want a favourite for the upcoming World Championships in Flanders, look no further than Wout van Aert. Although there is going to be an enormous amount of pressure on him and his teammates on home roads. I really cannot wait for that race. Van Aert now has more wins this season than any other male pro, 13, and according to Cillian Kelly, Sunday marked the first day in history that both Van der Poel and Van Aert had won a race on the same day. Ethan Hayter too could be with a shout at the upcoming World Championships. He's really shot up a level this year, and there's no shame in being beaten by the best all-rounder the sport has seen since Sean Kelly. Hayter can be proud and was consistent enough to head home with the points jersey, a stage win, a team time trial win, and second on GC. 11th on the final day, in fact, was his worst result of the entire week, and it now feels like a case of when he'll win a huge race rather than if. Other notable performances from the week in Britain came from Robin Carpenter, who was so strong for rally cycling on Stage 2 that not only could he not be caught by the bunch, he also went into the leader's jersey for a day. And a mention should also go to Jacob Scott of Canyon DHB, who animated many of the breakaways, and he was in the KOM jersey from start to finish. Moving on, and we had another pro race in France yesterday in the form of the Grand Prix Fourmies. The race would finish in a bunch sprint, and it was fantastic to see Elia Viviani back to his winning ways on the road. He beat Pascal Ackermann and Fernando Gaviria, giving him his 6th win of the season and his 3rd in the last 3 weeks. Here's what he had to say after his latest win.
It's clear after the Olympics that my shape is good, so to win in Poitou-Charentes, some crashes stop a little bit, but today we was really committed, and I asked the team to put me in position before the downhill because I think it was the topic moment, and then from that moment I followed before Lotto Soudal and then later on Ackermann, and yeah, I was the fastest, so really happy with this win.
And it feels like that won't be the last win the Italian gets for Cofidis this season. In the women's race, which is called La Choralist Fourmies Féminin, it was a first ever pro win for 20-year-old Pfeiffer Georgie of Team DSM. She'd gone clear with Rachel Naylor, now riding for Park Hotels Valkenburg, and managed to get the better of her to the line. Zanardi, who'd won that European Under-23 Championship 2 days before, took 3rd on the day. Right, I'll move on now to what's coming up on GCN Plus this week, and the answer again is a lot. Believe it or not, there's no racing at all today, but tomorrow the Tour of Luxembourg will start, and it's got a very high-level start list this year. Nibali, Almeida, Chavez, De La Cruz, Ayuso, Mollema, Pinot, Gaudu, Ewan, Kuznefroy, Jungels, O'Connor and Quintana amongst others. That continues on through to this Saturday, one day before the World Championships kick off in Belgium with the men's individual time trial. On Wednesday, the late season flurry of Italian one-day classics begins with the Giro della Toscana, followed the next day by the Coppa Sabatini, and there are also a few one-day races in Belgium at the same time. We've got the hilly Grand Prix Wallonie on Wednesday, the Championship of Flanders on Friday, and the Primus Classic on Saturday. There is also the 5-day Tour of Slovakia starting on Wednesday, and if that wasn't enough already, Germany plays host to the Eschborn-Frankfurt one-day race on Sunday. I mean, I'm shattered with all the racing myself. Goodness only knows how the riders must be feeling at this point in the season. As ever, there are some territory restrictions on a couple of those races, so please check what is available where you are. And I haven't actually even finished with what's coming up, as we've also got the second round of the Ethias Cross Series on Saturday, which leads me nicely on to the first round from last Saturday in Lokeren. Now, it's always a bit bizarre to see cyclocross taking place in warm and dry conditions, but that's exactly what they had on the day. In the women's race, a trio of riders batted it out on the final lap, but with two from the same team, it was always going to be very hard for Aniek van Alphen to take the win. Fen van Empel allowed a small gap to open up to her teammate Denise Betsema in front of her, and she didn't need a second invitation, stomping on the pedals to get her season off to a dream start. The result was much more clear-cut in the men's race, with Eli Iserbyt, the European champion, already solo before they'd even reached the halfway mark of the race. He would end up cruising around the closing stages, beating Lars van der Haar by 11 seconds, with Michael van Turenhout in third. Just before we finish with the racing, I wanted to also mention the Route de l'Ardèche, even though unfortunately we don't have any footage from that race. There was another good news story there, which came from a bad one. So on Saturday night, Team Bike Exchange had all their bikes stolen, in exchange for nothing, it seems. But the team were able to continue racing thanks to the help of Trek Segafredo, Live Racing and Movistar, who lent them some of their spare bikes. Always wonderful, isn't it, to hear those kinds of stories. Great rivalries, but at the same time, all in it together. The race still has 2 stages remaining as I record this, but as things stand, Leah Thomas leads the general classification for Movistar. She won stage 2, whilst the other stages have been won by Arlena Sierra, Chloe Hoskin, Ruth Winder and Marta Bastianelli. In other good news, Stig Broeckx is back on the bike, which is great to see. Now, for those of you who don't remember, Broeckx was a promising young rider from Belgium whose career was cut short after an awful collision with a race motorbike at the Tour of Belgium in 2016. It was an incident which changed his life forever, but despite the challenges he now faces, Stig remains incredibly upbeat. And yesterday, he rode 30 kilometres to raise money for the Stichting Hersenstrijd, which is a charity which funds research on brain injuries caused by accidents. Former pro Bram Tankink was riding alongside him, and it's him we have to thank for the footage there of Stig. Back to racing now, literally, as Sam Bennett rode the European Road Championships for Ireland on Sunday. As you might expect, Patrick Lefevere wasn't too happy about that. Speaking to Het Newsblad, he said that Bennett was playing with his balls in public, seemingly implying that he's never played with Bennett's balls in public. He's apparently going to slash Bennett's wages from September onwards, as he's allowed to do so if a rider has been competitively inactive for 3 months, as is the case for Bennett. And it's a saga that looks set to continue on for some time. Behind the scenes, you'd have thought, under normal circumstances, but probably publicly if what's happened so far is anything to go by. As it was, Bennett was in trouble right from the beginning of the race. Not a surprise, I guess, given his lack of racing and training, and on a course that was far from ideal for him, and he would later abandon. Meanwhile, the relationship between Movistar and Miguel Angel Lopez is also on the rocks at the moment. After the Colombians' withdrawal from La Vuelta in the penultimate stage of the race, Anzue spoke to Spanish radio last week to say that they are looking into terminating his contract, which had been extended by 2 years just before the Tour of Spain started. There's been no official news about that since, but Italian sports daily Gazzetta seems to think he could be returning to his former team Astana. Tom Dumoulin has had to cut his season short. It's already been shortened, of course, after that time away from the sport at the start of the year. But the Dutchman was hit by a car in training last week. He's vowed, though, to return to competition in 2022. On to transfer news now, and there have been some fairly big ones over the last week. Alpecin Fenix have been particularly busy, and their latest recruit is Rob Stannard from Team Bike Exchange. The talented young Australian has been with that squad since he turned pro 3 years ago, and although he's yet to win a pro race, it feels like a big one is just around the corner. Alpecin have also signed Michael Gogol from Team Quebec and Next Hash, and have extended the contracts of Sinner Layson and Jimmy Janssens. Vuelta a España star rider Odd Christian Eiking is leaving Intermarché Wanty-Gobert at the end of this year. He'll be riding for EF Education Nippo next year, further bolstering their climbing talent. And in turn, Intermarché have signed the Danish rider Julius Johansson from Uno X and 20-year-old Frenchman Hugo Paget from Groupama FDJ Development Squad. Meanwhile, Uno X women's squad have signed Julie Leth, who's been with Sarah Tizip WNT for the last 2 years, and Max Canter is headed to Team Movistar from DSM. And there have also been a couple of riders that have said they're leaving teams, but whose destination is as yet unknown. The first of those is David de la Cruz, currently with UAE Team Emirates and having ridden very solidly at the Vuelta. And the second is Owain Doull, who spent his entire career so far with the Ineos Grenadiers. Soroya Paladin will leave Live Racing next year to join Canyon SRAM, and Jakob Fuglsang is rumoured to be leaving Astana to join Team Bike Exchange, which I must admit I didn't see coming. And finally, Kyle Reinen has called an end to his career as a World Tour rider with Trek Segafredo, but will continue working with that brand as he embarks on a new career in gravel racing as of next year. That is a branch of the sport that will continue to get more and more competitive as the years go on, I reckon. Okay, that's me done for today. I thoroughly enjoyed that. So many good news stories in bike racing in a single week. Great stuff. Hopefully there will be more this coming week and I'll be back with it all next Monday, so I hope to see you then.